Ives, Three Places in New England. A New England Symphony. Charles Ives was born in 1874 and died in 1954. He was a composer of genius for whom music was a hobby. In Ives's mind, real American men worked for a living. Ives himself was a highly respected insurance executive who, like thousands of others, commuted by train to his office in Lower Manhattan from the burbs in Connecticut, where he lived. The experimental nature of so much of Ives's music, combined with his amateur status and his pathological fear of self-promotion, condemned the great bulk of his music to obscurity for decades. A case in point is Three Places in New England, a work that Ives referred to as his New England Symphony, which had to wait 15 years for its premiere. Ives completed what was to be the first version of the piece in 1914. It sat untouched for 15 years. Enter Nicholas Slonimsky, a Russian-born American composer, conductor, pianist, and writer. In 1927, Slonimsky, who referred to himself as a failed Wunderkind, I just love that, Slonimsky founded the Boston Chamber Orchestra and proceeded to solicit music from contemporary composers. In 1929, Ives's Three Places in New England was brought to his attention. In his autobiography, Slonimsky recalled the encounter. Quote, "As I looked over the score, I experienced a strange but unmistakable feeling that I was looking at a work of genius. I cannot tell precisely why this music produced such an impression on me. The score possessed elements that seemed to be mutually incompatible and even incongruous, that nevertheless created a spiritual catharsis," unquote. Slonimsky's enthusiasm warmed every cockle in Ives's underappreciated heart, and Ives prepared an entirely new version of the piece to accommodate Slonimsky's smallish orchestra. Three Pieces received its public premiere under Slonimsky's baton at New York's Town Hall on January 10, 1931. 3 days after the performance, Ives appraised the performance in a letter to his friend, T. Carl Whitmer. We quote Ives, "It went fairly well. Slonimsky is a remarkable man. But a few of the players, especially the older first chair men, are soft-eared, soft-headed, dumb, and lazy. However, the younger men played well and were interested in the piece. Moral? Beware of old men," unquote. The old men notwithstanding, Ives and Slonimsky were encouraged enough by the reception of Three Places in New England to take it on the road. And as a result, Ives's Three Places became one of the first American works for orchestra to be performed in Europe. Immediately before its Paris premiere on June 6, 1931, Ives wrote Slonimsky, quote, "Just kick into the music as you did in Town Hall. Never mind the right notes, they're always a nuisance. Just let the spirit of the stuff sail up to the Eiffel Tower and on to heaven," unquote. The concert, attended by many of the most important musicians and critics in Europe, was a success. They were fascinated by Ives's Three Places and what they considered its intrinsic Americanism, its boldness and imagination, its stylistic inclusivity, which was correctly perceived as a metaphor for the American melting pot, and its glancing references to ragtime, plantation songs, and patriotic songs that gave it an American authenticity without being jingoistic. According to Ives' biographer Jan Swafford, quote, "Slonimsky returned to America the ultra-modernist's conquering hero," unquote. In those days, when an American artist had to first score in Europe before he or she could be taken seriously in America, Ives's music returned a conquering hero as well. Slowly but surely, it began to be performed and admired. Yes, until the end of his life in 1954, Ives's music would continue to be discovered. But in truth, it was Nicholas Slonimsky's performance of Ives's Three Places in New England that permanently put Ives's music on the American musical map. Like it or not, it existed and was increasingly available to those who chose to seek it out. For Ives, his later-in-life discovery was bittersweet. At the time of the Paris concert, he was a 57-year-old coronary invalid who had stopped composing years before. In 1935, Three Places was the first of Ives's works to be commercially published, not incidentally by the House of G. Schirmer. Characteristic of Ives was his insistence that his name be printed as small as possible on the cover, claiming that he didn't want to look egotistical. When the piece finally began being performed and recorded with some regularity in the 1950s and 1960s, it was the later 1929 version that was performed. Thanks to the efforts of the conductor and Ives scholar James Sinclair, who reconstructed Ives's original 1914 version of the piece, there are now three extant versions of Ives's Three Places in New England: the 1914 version for large orchestra, the 1929 version for Nicholas Slonimsky's chamber orchestra, and a fleshed-out edition of the 1929 version for full orchestra. Charles Edward Ives, 1874 to 1954. Charlie Ives was an all-American kid. He was born and raised in Danbury, Connecticut, where he lived, by his own admission, the perfect New England childhood, in the sort of idyllic late 19th century small-town America that today has been mythologized in our collective memory. Along with Ives's Connecticut Yankee upbringing, which he spent the bulk of his creative life memorializing in his music, the great formative influence in his life was his father, George Edward Ives. George Ives inspired his son with two most non-traditional musical beliefs. The first was that the world of sound offered an infinite number of possibilities to be savored and explored. The second was that music was a metaphor for the democratic ideals that shaped America, and as such, it was an inclusive art, an art in which distinctions between popular, sacred, and concert music were immaterial when compared to its universal power to move and enlighten. Ives's own music is a synthesis of 1, his classical training, 2, his love for American music of every kind, from patriotic march music to spirituals, gospel, ragtime, Protestant hymns, popular song, and folk song. 3, the New England of his childhood. 4, experimentation. And 5, Ives's unwavering belief that music was the common language that bound together all humanity in all places at all times. In 1894, when he was 20 years old and a student at Yale, Ives brought his music composition professor, Horatio Parker, a work entitled Song for the Harvest Season, scored for voice, clarinet, trombone, and organ, in which each instrument plays in a different key. Parker's famous reaction was, quote, "Ives, must you always hog all the keys?" unquote. The issue, of course, was not one of hogging. The issue was inclusivity. Ives's belief that all things musical were fundamentally related and therefore fundamentally compatible. Ives's belief in inclusivity is most readily apparent in his use of musical quotations. Ives was a liberal idealist who put his ideals and his money where his mouth was. He refused to copyright his music, claiming that all music belonged to all people. When some of his music was finally published, he refused to keep his royalties and instead donated the money to charity. He used his considerable wealth to support other composers and musical endeavors, although the benefactors of his generosity rarely knew where the money came from because Ives's gifts were almost always given anonymously. Unfortunately, Ives's isolation from the larger musical community came at a price. His music, which was just a little ahead of its time, was ridiculed by those professionals who saw him as an amateur crank. It wasn't until the 1930s that the world really began to discover who Ives was, and more than any other single piece, the vehicle of that discovery was his orchestral set number 1, Three Places in New England.